fellow mechaniacs and non-orc hobbyists, and welcome to a long-delayed new episode of Sork's Mekshop. Sorry for the gap in releases. I let the real world get in the way of the hobby for a bit, as we all do sometimes, and that affected the filming schedule. But on the plus side, I acquired a spiffy new camera to use, and so hopefully you'll find the video quality has improved since the Happy Little Orccident series. Today's video is a departure from Orc Miniatures, as I picked up the new Eldari Combat Patrol and decided to use it as an opportunity to show you all a few different miniature painting techniques. One of the techniques I'm showing off today was actually inspired by a friend of mine, Emily. Her son Otto is a very bright and resilient young warrior who's currently in treatment for cancer for the second time in his young life. So, for whatever it's worth to the tiny audience I have, I'm giving a shout out to both of them, and I hope to continue to get good news from them about his treatment and his progress. Since my first video was about my new Harder Steenbeck airbrush, I decided to start today's miniature showing you a few airbrush techniques, including random patterning and masking, as well as testing out its precision for my own enjoyment. For those of you without an airbrush, I'm also going to repeat those techniques using more inexpensive tools so that you can see the difference in its results. After that, I'll do just a little bit of rapid edge highlighting and touch-ups before going into using oil paint for panel lining. I've been using oil paints for a few years now, ever since being inspired by the incomparable Marco Frazzoni on his channel, Not Just Mecha, link in the description. As always, I'm aiming this video at the average hobbyist. I'm not a Gold Demon painter, not even close, and so I'm going to try and keep things at a level that's accessible to anyone, and I'll do my best to explain things in a way that you can follow along at home. I did accelerate the videos this time because they got pretty long, so let me know if you don't like that in the comments. Lastly, I'm going to take a page out of my old Army notebook, and at the end of the video, I'm going to do a bit of an AAR, or After Action Review, where I talk about things that could be done to improve the results, should you choose to do so. Even though I had a plan going into the model, I am at heart a software engineer, and so I'm always looking for ways to make things better and more efficient. Hope you enjoy.
We have it primed black, assembled, all those good things, ready for us to begin the painting process. The first technique I'm going to demonstrate is to generate random patterns on the models. Taking a combination of white and yellow artist ink through the airbrush, and we're using a popsicle stick and bouncing the airbrush ink off the stick. It creates a splatter pattern, as you saw on against the board there for demonstration. We'll go through and you'll see it as we go do it on the models. Here I'm using my dry palette that you saw in the orc videos to stick with some poster tack each of the models to that surface to make it a little easier to do them kind of as a group. And then once again I go with the popsicle stick and I bounce that ink out of the airbrush onto them in just little bursts, using short bursts to go around them little by little. I don't want to overdo it in any one shot. I want to make sure that I build it up slowly so that I get the effect that I want without oversaturating anything and just turning them all yellow. So as you can see, I'm kind of spritzing a little bit on each one, going around, making sure I'm hitting the backs, making sure I'm hitting the sides, making sure I'm hitting the fronts. And while it looks like they're fairly heavily hit once you go around all the way here, the next part of the process is going to help to make it so we're not actually seeing all that yellow anymore. It's going to end up being a mix of the yellow and the black. But as you can see from here, from all angles, we've hit them. The next part of the technique is using that Halloween spider silk, and we're using this as a mask. So with airbrushing, sometimes you don't want to hit all parts of the model, and so you need to block it off in some fashion. The masks that you use to do that a lot of times you can use just masking tape, or you can use your fingers to block off the airbrush. In this case, we're getting a little creative, and we're actually going to use this spider silk. This is the technique that I was talking about that my friend Emily suggested to me. It was actually for her partner Alex's marble bases. We'll do marble bases in another video, but what I'm doing here is essentially wrapping the strands of the spider silk around the model, and on the flat parts I'm teasing it out. I'm kind of spreading the fibers out a little bit, and as I wrap it around, what's going to happen is that any of those spots that have the thicker silk are going to completely block the paint that we spray on the model later on. Any of the spots that have the thinner silk are going to partially block the ink that we spray on it later on, or the paint that we spray on it later on. And so what that does is it's going to create kind of a random but interesting patterned effect on the model that I'm hoping, and this is all kind of experimental as I'm doing this, but I was hoping would turn out to be kind of an interesting camouflage pattern for our Wraith Blade, which I'm going after what's the Eldar faction called Alaitoc. Alaitoc are known for kind of a black and blue camo with some yellow accent bits. So that's why I went with the yellow ink to start with. I included a little bit of white ink to help overcome the black, because yellow has a hard time covering black sometimes. And then here I'm using, as I said, the spider silk, and just sort of taking my time wrapping around all the different parts in order to create that mask. Excuse me, create all that mask to create essentially these lines, these random patterns, and the camouflage patterns around it. It was a little tricky here. I'll talk later on about having tried this a few different ways, a few different times, and coming up with a few tricks to make it a little bit easier on myself. The first time I did it, I tried to cover the whole model all at once in kind of a net, spreading out all the spider silk at once. I realized that didn't work very well, so this technique where I'm going and I'm twisting the spider silk, as you can see, into thinner strands, and then trying to use that as a wrapping as opposed to encasing the entire model in a net, works a little bit better. It's a little bit easier to manage, but it does require a little bit of time. Overall, the process that we're talking about here took me something in the neighborhood of 10 minutes or so just to do the wrappings themselves. But I think you'll find that the overall process of doing these wrappings looks pretty cool in the end, and it's definitely easier than going through and trying to paint a similar camo pattern on by hand at the end of the day. So as I said, once again, we wrap first, and then when we hit a flat spot of the panel, we try to tease out, spread out the fibers to create some interesting patterns across the flat panels. Because honestly, the flat panels are where you're going to see those things the best anyway, once the model's painted. So that's where I was trying to emphasize things. And then I'm using the tension of wrapping it around pieces to hold it in place and keep it tight. I think if you wanted to, you might be able to use like little bits of glue maybe, or maybe little bits of the poster tack to hold it in place, but I didn't try to do any of that here, so your mileage may vary. You'll have to try it on your own and report back. Let me know how it turned out. As you look at the model, you'll see it looks pretty heavily covered, and to be completely frank, when I first was doing this, I thought, oh, did I put too much spider silk on there? And you'll have to judge for yourself once we get done painting it. I don't think it did, but you can judge and let me know what you think. Just getting a few more spots here done, teasing it out, and then once I'm done teasing it out, I kind of gather it up at the bottom in order to get the remainder out of the way. I do use some poster tack here to try to hold it in one place at the bottom, and then I pin it to the top of a bottle in order to give myself a platform on which to spray. Here I'm using some cerulean blue artist ink from Liquitex, just a little bit into the airbrush there. And again, one of the things I really like about using artist inks in the airbrush is that you don't really have to mix them with anything if you don't want to. You can use them right out of the bottle. Sometimes it's good to mix them, if you want a thinner consistency, if you want to be more transparent, if you want them to have a different finish, if you want them to be more matte or more glossy or what have you. But as far as I'm concerned, 9 times out of 10, I'll just drop them right into the airbrush pot and get to work, and I'll get the results I want. The technique here is to just use fairly short bursts of airbrush. You press down the top of the plunger on the airbrush and you hold it, give it a lot of air, and then you pull back slowly until you get little bursts of paint out through the air. So lots of air, just a little bit of paint. Keep working that as you build up. If you go too heavy on the paint, then what'll happen is you'll actually saturate that spider silk that we put on there, and so it'll soak through, and you'll kind of overcome the mask, if you will, since it is in fact still a cloth kind of medium, or it's a fiber kind of medium, so it can be soaked through. It can run. Your airbrush ink can run. It can trickle. So you want to do little bursts. You're painting fairly dry with the airbrush here, and like I said, lots of air, a little bit of paint or ink in this case, and just kind of build up over time. Hit different parts of the model as you're waiting for one to dry. Use the airbrush itself with just the air going out to dry off parts as you need to. Once it's done, we're gonna wait. In this case, I waited probably an hour or so, went got dinner, and then came back because I wanted to make sure that the ink was in fact completely dry. And then I came back and started peeling the fibers off from the spider silk. You don't have to be super gentle here. I was just trying to make sure I didn't scratch anything with the knife itself. The fibers themselves aren't sticking to the model at all, except for where they're catching on spiky bits and whatnot, and you just have to kind of unravel. So it's a trick of mostly being patient and not breaking the model by pulling too hard, and just seeing where it catches and where it doesn't catch, teasing it out. And then when you get to really stubborn spots, you just go in there again with the knife, cut it, unwrap it, cut it and wrap it, and so on. This was probably, frankly, the fiddliest part of the process, was just trying to get the silk back off of it again. And there's probably a few ways to mitigate that, but in this case, again, this was like the second time I did it, and so I was still learning. But again, it was not difficult, just a little time consuming and a little fiddly with regard to kind of getting in there and seeing where things were getting caught and where things needed to be moved away from and so forth. Once I got all the major pieces off, I just kind of went through and picked away at it and tried to get the remaining little bits off of it. There's a few hairs and strands here and there, and I went through with my fingertips, pulled them out, and eventually got everything except for one or two hairs, which I ended up pulling out with tweezers later on as I noticed them, and just worked to clean the whole thing up and try to avoid having any residual fibers before the next stage of the painting process. You can even see it here as it's coming off. You can see where there's those black stripes in there, and even a few of the yellow dots still. And that's really what we're going for, right? That's the contrast between the lighter blue and the darker black, and then just a few yellow dots in there. That's kind of that camouflage effect that we were trying to get out of this masking technique. Once again, trying to do this with regular paint and brushes and whatnot. Here's another model that I did using some thinner wrappings. So just to give you a sense of a little bit of difference, I think I like the one on the left a little better. It has a little bit of more black to it. It's a little more contrast. This next model, I wrapped once again using a very similar technique. I did tighten the spider silk up a little bit when I did this technique. But what I'm showing you here is essentially how to do the same thing, but without an airbrush. Instead, we're using a makeup sponge, and we're using the exact same blue, but we're using it as a paint instead of as a ink. And we're using a dabbing motion with the sponge. So get a little bit of paint on the sponge, tap it onto the card that I have there to remove some of it so it's not oversaturating the model, and then just tapping as much through the spider silk strands as you can, getting the blue in all the crevices and just sort of everywhere you can throughout the model. This takes a little bit longer than using the airbrush, and one of the things I noticed is that even though the blue paint and the blue ink are the exact same shade of blue, they have the exact same pigments, they're both by the same manufacturer, this approach actually takes and results in a slightly darker blue at the end of the process. So if I were to do it again, I would probably do some pre-highlighting using a dry brush or what have you. Here I'm just cutting the sponge down to have an easier time getting into some of the harder to reach places. But anyway, I'd probably do some pre-highlighting with a dry brush or similar in order to get a lighter blue. or possibly just go over it again with blue mixed with some white or maybe a bone or an off-white of some sort in order to brighten up the blue a little bit more than what we ended up getting. But overall, this is really just an experiment to see if using this sponging technique will result in a model that still has that kind of stripy, spidery, random camo pattern. And so here I'm just doing the same thing on the hand. The axe fell off when I was trying to wrap it. So, okay, so we'll unwrap that one later. Jumping ahead, we're now going to use another masking technique. This is a camo putty mask that we're going to use in order to airbrush the head of the first model. And it works a lot like poster tack. The main difference is that this is pretty much made for the hobbyist, and paint doesn't really stick to it as much. It doesn't embed itself into the putty as much as it would on your poster tack type products. It's also, you can get it a lot thinner than I found you can get poster tack. So what I'm doing here is I kind of rolled it out into pieces, and now I'm using a silicone sculpting tool to sort of push it into the neck joints around the head of the model. And I'm using it to, like I said, just mask off all the bits around the head that I don't want to turn yellow. That's really the goal. I want to paint this head, and I don't want to paint anything around it. So I'm using this mask to do that. Once again, I've mentioned before, there's a lot of different ways to achieve this effect. I'm just trying to show you several different ways to use masking with your airbrushing in order to paint the things you want and not paint the things you don't want. So again, the first approach was using the spider webs to do a camo pattern, a weird random masking for the camo. This one is a more targeted masking where you're being very diligent to isolate one part of your model in order to get it a different color without a lot of overspray or getting it on the parts of the model you don't want. We're going to start with putting some white ink in the airbrush. Once again, the yellow going over blue would take a few layers, might turn green. So I'm starting off with white ink in order to really just kind of clean it up, as well as the leftover black that's on there. So I'm essentially creating a re-baseline of the entire head with the white ink first. Same technique as we did with the blue before, where I'm really using a lot of air and just a little bit of ink going through here and there in order to lay down several very thin layers and kind of drying them as I go using the air. Then I replace that with a golden yellow from the Liquitex line. This is sort of an Indian yellow or golden yellow, anything like that that's sort of on the darker end of the yellow spectrum. And this will serve as kind of our base color, or also our shade color in this case. And we're going to use this as a way to sort of set the main tone of the head. And then we'll come back later on with additional yellow layers to create the brighter yellow on the main dome of the helmet, so that we have a little bit of visual interest going from the darker sections to the parts with a brighter highlight. And so you see I just kind of work it up a little bit slowly around the edges first and then towards the center. I'm also saving a little bit of time by not doing a unified coverage of this everywhere, because if I'm trying to take a darker color and then I know I want to make a lighter highlight somewhere, then rather than just covering it everywhere dark and then trying to go lighter again, if I'm starting out with white, then I just put the darker parts where I want it, leave the white, or at least some of the white, in the highlights, and then come back with my medium yellow, or I think it's medium yellow azo ink, to then come in and turn the highlights into a more yellowed color rather than leaving them pure white. And it goes a lot quicker that way, again, rather than having to retone the darker yellow. I just go from white to yellow. And in this case, I just add a little bit of white to that medium azo yellow to continue to brighten up the highlights of the brighter spots. And in this case, that's going to be the top of the helmet, the backside, as well as what would be kind of the face if this thing had a face. then once that's thoroughly dried, you just kind of come back and peel the masking off, and you can see that it's nice and cleanly painted, mostly separated. I did get a little bit under the neck, but it's not really visible from the tabletop. In fact, you can't see it on the video at all. But okay, moving on from the airbrush, we're going to pick up the hairbrush, and we're going to begin with a quick wash of Army Painter Speed Paint. Using a light, kind of a medium brown wash, we're going over the bone colored parts to create a very simple shade color. And that'll be all the bone parts pretty much, except for the actual blade of the axe. This is sort of to create an initial shade color. I really just was doing this to create some contrast and sort of help myself visualize where I wanted to go next. As I've said before, a lot of miniature painting for me is really experimental and just sort of seeing how things look and then deciding what I want to change and what I want to do differently as I proceed throughout the project. Especially if I'm doing the first model of a squad or the first model of an army, I want to see how things are going and make some decisions about where I want them to go next and what I want to do differently, and then at the end, kind of do a little bit of an AAR or after action review and reevaluate the process, figure out what I can do differently to improve it in the future, make it more efficient, make it quicker, use less paint, make it look better, whatever things I think I might be able to do to improve. So I'll put this lay this on everywhere, and then after that I'll start thinking through what I want to do to make the edge of the axe look cooler, the actual main axe blade. And maybe there's also some runes on the arm blade. And so that's where we're going to use this Army Painter Seafoam color, as well as we're mixing it together a little bit with some of the Army Painter Speed Paint Medium to thin it out a little bit. I wanted to really let the underlying bone show through a little bit more. I didn't want to make it too saturated. So I thinned it out at a 1-to-1 mix and just kind of slopping it on everywhere on the axe blade. And then on the arm blade, I'm going to be a little more careful when I get there, and just kind of getting only in the runic areas, and trying to be very careful not to overpaint it outside the lines of the runes, and getting it onto the bony parts of the blade, or the parts that I just shaded with that medium brown color. So just kind of keeping it on the inside there. And then once again, we'll give that some time to dry before we move on to the next step. The technique I'm using here, some people might disagree with me on the approach, but I tend to like to use the largest brush I possibly can for a given task. In this case, I'm using, I think it was about a number 3 or number 4 flat brush, and I'm using it for edge highlighting, which seems like a very detailed kind of approach a detailed technique to use for such a large brush. But what I find with it is that, number one, it's got a nice tight edge to it, and so I can use it in a fairly tight manner in most places anyway. Number two, using the larger brush forces me into a kind of sketchy style, a very quick approach to it, which cuts down on the amount of time I spend and allows me to rough in highlights and other painting, relatively quickly. So it really forces me to think about what are the most important parts. The approach I'm using here is one called overbrushing, which is similar to dry brushing, except that your brush isn't dry. It's used a lot more in oil painting usually than acrylic painting, but I've taken the technique over into my acrylic practice just because I find it very effective as a way to add a kind of heavy layer of initial highlights over the first set of washes. And what you'll find is when you do it this way, it'll leave just the very darkest, deepest shadows in place, and it'll allow you to really visualize sort of where the most important parts of the shadows are. At least that's the way I use it anyway. So I'm using that to kind of go over all the bone parts and pick out the edges, not only on the backpack and the arm blade and the axe haft, but I'm also going to go through and use it to kind of correct some of my mistakes. What you might not see very well in the video is that the axe haft itself reactivated when I put the wash on. I hadn't waited long enough for the previous bone color to dry. And so it was still just a little bit wet, and it reactivated and stripped off some of the paint because of the Army Painter speed paint. And so now I'm using this overbrushing to both kind of highlight some of the areas, but also correct the missing bone in some of the other areas as well. And then just once again kind of going through again, this time in slightly smaller areas, sort of like we do with layering, going through slightly smaller areas and re-emphasizing some of the highlights. And then even going in on that axe blade itself, which is not bone, obviously, but I thought, let's give it a shot. We'll go ahead and highlight it with this bone color. I find that a lot of times using a bone, off-white bone kind of highlight color for larger portions of the model, especially if they're all kind of this pastel kind of similar colors, is a very quick way of getting a quick highlight and just sort of get a sense of where the highlights should be or can be. And then if you really want to come back and fix them later and trying to get it to a better than tabletop standard, then you can always do that with a more specialized color. But for my money, if I'm doing something like this where I have a lot of bone and then I have some kind of a pastel color like this, that universal highlight of that bone both unifies those two colors, makes them look like they're sitting in the same light, as well as allows me to get done quickly and then come back later and decide if I want to refine it and make it a little bit more special or whatever. So the next step is taking a lighter version of the blue that I picked, and this is another, it's an Army Painter War Paint light blue. I didn't record which one it is, apologies, but it's a lighter blue, and I'm just going through and doing a very quick edge highlighting. Now I am using a smaller brush in this case. I think I'm using a number 1 round brush to just go in and pick out the edges of the armor, the gems, all that sort of thing on the main body of my Wraith blade, excuse me. And trying to just give a little bit extra pop to the edges, a little bit extra highlight steps to it. Once again, it's intended to be, in this step anyway, very quick, very dirty, just kind of seeing what it's gonna look like, and deciding later if I want to go back and make it look better or if I want to do some more work on it. The other thing I'll say is that we did the here I go back to using the flat brush again because I'm seeing that I have some larger areas to cover, so using the larger brush to try to gain some speed and to try to cover more ground in each shot or each brush stroke. What I was going to say though was that, similar to using the bone color or the titanium buff in this case as a universal highlight for my bone and for my seafoam, in this case I'm using that lighter blue as a universal highlight for both the blue and the black parts of my camouflage, because when it's set against the darker blue, it looks like a lighter blue. When it's set against the black, it looks like kind of a medium or light gray. And so you can use that as sort of a time-saving technique to get a highlight across both parts of the camouflage pattern that look good against either one of them without having to spend the extra time to highlight each individual chunk of camouflage independently of the others. And once again, just like with the bone and the seafoam pieces, it helps it look like it's sitting in the same kind of light as the pieces around it. And so you're not looking like each part's independently highlighted and each part is getting a different sunbeam hitting or what have you. As you work your highlights down your model, it's important to remember that not every spot in the model is going to have the same amount of light hitting it. So as you paint your lower highlights, you want to make sure, even though you're using the same techniques, you're using the same colors, you might want to dial back the highlights just a little bit as you get lower down the model. So the amount of brightness that's hitting the foot, for example, is not going to be the same amount of brightness that's hitting the elbow or the shoulder. And you want to account for that as you're doing each of your highlights. And one way you can do that, or that I do it rather, is by drawing out the paint a little bit more on my wet palette, which thins it a little bit more as I go. And so thinner paint is going to allow the lower layer to show through a little bit more. And so as I thin it more going down the model, I'm essentially creating less and less coverage as I go down the model as well, which in turn means slightly darker and darker highlights as I go down the model. So it's sort of a complementary technique to keeping your paints thin to begin with. Similarly, you could accomplish the same thing by making fewer passes as you go down the model in order to keep the highlights a little bit more muted as you go. Or kind of eyeballing it as I'm doing here, where I'm realizing that some of my upper highlights are not kind of getting as much attention as they need, so I go back up, do another pass on the upper highlights, or another pass on a spot that's particularly jutting out, or what have you. It's just something to kind of keep an eye on, is that the highlights you're doing should not be uniform all over the model. They should be picked out as appropriate based on their exposure to the light and based on, you know, how high up they're on the model and how important they are to the scene as well. The other thing to remember is that people are going to be looking at these things and they're going to be focusing on what you want them to focus on. In the case of this model, I really wanted to focus on the helmet. So that's one of the reasons why I picked a very contrasting color to the rest of the model, right? I've got a kind of a cool blue to most of the model, and then the helmet's this very vibrant yellow. So we're focused on the face. In this case here, I'm no longer doing highlights. I'm actually just sort of fixing the loincloth there, or the tabard, because there was some overspray on that. And so I'm going back and painting it a cool white, off-white color by just sort of thinning out and adding a little bit of white to the blue color there to turn it into sort of an off-white. After that, adding a little bit of white ink to the titanium buff, and we're going to use that as a highlight color for the bone and the seafoam. As before, we're going to use a universal highlight color, and this is going to be it. It's about a 50-50 mix roughly of the white ink and the titanium buff from before. Going through and once again focusing mostly on the areas that are getting the most light as we're going over the tops of the model, and the upper edges and the areas that are going to be receiving the most bounce light. Okay, just about finished up here. Last couple highlights, and then we'll be finishing it up. After completing it, we're gonna give it a nice long, probably half hour to sit, make sure it's just completely dry before we move on to the oil wash stage. Now the oil wash technique that we're going to be using today is going to be using burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and we're really just going for a specific kind of oil wash called panel lining. And what panel lining, also known as pin washing, is it's really aiming at just getting essentially the cracks between two components on your model. So like between two armor plates, or around a gemstone, or around a bolt, or anything like that. So it's essentially trying to draw a line around something, is essentially what you're trying to do. So what I'm doing here is I take a very small amount of oil, I dropped in some white spirit, also known as odorless spirits, also known as mineral spirits, in a little squeeze bottle that I have there. And then I'm using the back of the brush to break up the oil and stir it in with the mineral spirit in order to create the wash consistency. Now, the wash consistency for panel lining is going to be very thin and runny. It's essentially going to be like a wash that you would have in any other miniature painting, and it's going to be thin enough that if you pick it up and you touch it to the model, you pick it up on a thin brush like this is called a liner brush, you pick it up and you touch it to the model, and it should immediately just follow whatever line you touch it to. So it's great because there's essentially zero surface tension to this solution of oil and mineral spirit. And if it's thin enough, it's the right amount of mineral spirit mixed in, then you literally just touch it to a seam between two components in your model, or like I said, around a bolt or whatever, and it'll just run along that seam until it runs out of fluid, and then you just go back and get more fluid and let it run again. So just touch it along, and there you go. Now, it's very easy with a steady hand to not have to worry about any excess, or worry about getting some that spills over or gets into stray spots. But if you do, not to worry. We'll show a cleanup step after this that is very, very easy. For now, it's good to have that steady hand and just kind of go around and touch the areas that you want to have the shadows for. But as I said, it's going to be easy to clean up afterwards as well. As I'm going around here, these are just going through all those little gem or protrusions, whatever they are, on the backpack or the spines of this armor, or a construct rather. The wraithbone kind of struts that are coming out of the back of him. They have these little protrusions around there that I'm going and just sort of touching around, kind of trying to emphasize them. One by one, again, just kind of dip, touch, one at a time. Touching around the hand, to provide that shadow around the handle of the axe. Same thing around the top of the hand, and then we'll get underneath the join between the axe head and the handle as well. Same kind of thing. It's a very thin line. You just touch right into it, and it creates a nice shadow. Just immediately follows the line. It's almost like magic. And as I said elsewhere in the video, I learned this technique from watching Marco Frazzoni back, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, something like that, on Not Just Mecha. Completely blew my mind when I first saw it. So now we're going to do the same thing with the ultramarine blue, mixing in some of the mineral spirit back of the brush, kind of stirring it up until it's as thin as we want it to be. And when I say as thin as we want it to be, there's no single number that's exactly right. I mean, if you want it to be thinner, you can make it thinner. Doing that is going to make it more likely that when you touch it to the seams, that if it's a seam that is going to be affected by gravity, let's say it's pointing downwards towards the bottom of your miniature, then it might spill out of the seam and you'll have a little more cleanup to do. That's the main limiting factor here. Alternatively, if you don't do it thin enough, if it's a little bit thicker than you want it to be, then it's just not going to run as fast, or it might not run at all, and you might want to thin it up a little bit more to get it to run more. But it's a very, very forgiving technique. So I encourage you to try it out. These are also, oil paints are about the same price roughly as most miniature paints, but they last literally forever. I bought my first set probably 5 or 6 years ago, right after I saw the stuff from Marco, and the first set of paints I have, I'm still using them. They don't run out if you're using them from my miniatures. They don't run out very quickly anyway. I won't say they never run out, but they last a really long time for miniatures because you use a tiny amount on any given miniature. So the same technique as before. I'm dipping in there and I'm just finding spots where there are seams that I want to emphasize, and I'm just sort of tapping the tip of the brush into those seams and letting the thinned down oil, with mineral spirits, sort of do its work, just letting it run out into there and creating those shadows for me as if by magic. Continuing to go around and finding any other spots that I want to emphasize. And the nice thing about oils, as I said before, is really the fact that with acrylic paints, you're pretty much just using an additive technique all the time. So that is, whenever you're painting with acrylics, you're going to add more acrylic paint to whatever you want to do. So you're going to add a layer to create your base coat. You'll add a layer to create a highlight. You'll add a layer to create a shadow. You might add another layer to create an edge highlight, and so on and so on. With oil paints, you can do that. You can still add layers like that, but you can also subtract oil paints to create effects. So you can actually use mineral spirits or even just sponges, which we'll do later on, to remove some of the oil paints and kind of smudge it, move it around, shape it, sculpt it even in some small ways to create different effects. And that subtractive nature of the oil paint is one of the things that's most powerful about it. So when I say that, for this particular technique, the reason that's important is because as I go through here, I'm going pretty quickly. I acknowledge that I've sped up the video, but even in real life, I'm going pretty quickly, and I'm not really being very picky about where I drop my tip of my brush, because I know from having done this many times that if I drop my brush in a spot and I realize later on, oh no, that was a bad spot to put some of this oil, or oh, that one, that I put too much oil in this spot, or I didn't put enough oil in that spot. Well, if I didn't put enough, obviously I can put more. But even if I put too much, I can back it off just a little bit. I can scrape some of it out a little bit with some of the techniques I'll show you later. If I put way too much in, I can get rid of all of it. If I put it in the wrong place completely, I can get rid of all of it, or I can get rid of a little bit, or I can blend it in. It's a very, very forgiving technique, even for beginners. You just have to know how the medium works and how to fix it. And it's otherwise going to be an extremely easy technique for anybody to pick up. Just getting the last couple spots here, and then we'll wrap it up and I'll jump over to showing you how to clean up after yourself. For cleanup, we're going to use these eyeshadow applicators. We could use other kinds of makeup sponges. We could use Q-tips. We could use paintbrushes. For this particular cleanup job, we're going to start with the eyeshadow applicators, and then we'll move on to using a paintbrush. The reason I like the eyeshadow applicators better for this is that Q-tips work great, but they also can leave hair behind. And I think we've already got enough fibers on this model from the spider webs already. I've got nothing here except the eyeshadow applicator. It's completely dry, and all I'm doing is very gently rubbing the model around the areas that I applied the oil wash panel line. The model itself is actually fairly durable. The sponge itself is fairly soft, but what I found is that it's the bigger problem is if you rub too hard or too much, you might actually chip your acrylic paint underneath if you're not careful. So what I like to do is start off very gently, just kind of rub off. The oil itself comes off pretty quickly and pretty easily. One thing I failed to mention is that you can leave your model to sit for hours, even a day or two if you want to, before doing this, after letting the oil wash get in there. But the longer you sit, the more the oil wash will stain the paint underneath it. You can remove the stain still, but it requires more work to remove the stains. So what I usually do is I'll give it like 20 to 30 minutes for most of these sorts of techniques here, most washing techniques, especially pin washes like this, before going to clean it up, because I'm not really trying to stain the area around it, but I am trying to let it set in the deepest parts. If you try to clean it right away, you run the risk of removing it from the shallowest of the areas of the model, which you don't want to do. So I found that for most of these sorts of things, for panel lining or pin washing, 20 to 30 minute wait time before cleaning is about ideal. It gives you enough time for the mineral spirits to evaporate just a little bit to allow the oil to set, but not so much time that it's going to stain on the higher surfaces. So you go in, rub it with a dry eyeshadow applicator, and then if you get to areas where there are some really stubborn pieces that don't want to come off with a dry one, especially on the higher surfaces, then you can come back and you can use a little mineral spirits either on a eyeshadow applicator, or you can use, if it's a very small area that you want to hit, you can use a paintbrush to apply some of the mineral spirits to the spot that you want to remove, and then rub it off either with another paintbrush or with the eyeshadow applicator again. The idea being that the mineral spirits will cause the oil to loosen up, to kind of reactivate, and you can get it off that way. Once again, the oil itself can stain and color the acrylic paint, because it'll actually, as it dries, it'll actually seep into the kind of microscopic spaces between the pigment flecks of your paint, and it'll stay there even when you rub on it with the sponge. But that could be okay, right? That might be part of the technique you're trying to do, and we will do that in a future video where we're trying to actually do all of our painting with oils. We'll want to. There's going to be some techniques where we actually want to stain the underlying acrylic and make it change its color permanently because of that. But in this case, we're trying to make a very clean panel line. Oh, here I'm trying to remove a fiber that I missed earlier with my tweezers. But we're trying to make a very clean panel line, and so because of that, we really don't want to stain the acrylic around the panel line. And so for that reason, I am coming back with the mineral spirits, which will loosen up the oil paint that has settled into the acrylic paints, and then I can rub it off again. Because it's reactivated, it's completely going to clean off, and it'll be completely back to the initial unstained acrylic color again. So, as I said earlier, it's an extremely forgiving technique for anybody at any skill level. You literally cannot make a mistake that can't be fixed. It's just a question of how much time you want to spend on it. You can add more paint, you can move it around, you can get rid of it, you can start over. You don't have to scrap the whole model and start over with a isopropyl alcohol bath. You can just clean off one piece of the model using the sponges or using the mineral spirits if you want to, and there you go. It's ready to go again, ready to start over, ready to build back up again if you want to. The only thing I will say that makes the oil paints a little more challenging than acrylics is the fact that, well, it's the same thing as the advantage. The advantage of them is that they have a really long working time. So you can, as I mentioned before, you can literally come back to them a day or two later and continue to work with them. The disadvantage is that they remain workable for a couple days, which generally isn't a problem. But if you want to paint over them, then you do want to make sure that they're cured at least enough that they're not going to interfere with the adhesion of your acrylic paints, which generally means I like to wait overnight before trying to paint acrylic over them. There may be some other techniques that allow you to paint faster, but that's usually what I like to do.
Thank you all for joining me on another hobby adventure. I hope you enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making this. The principles of masking, random patterns, universal shading, and highlighting apply to more than the specific application that I use them for here. And if you choose to use them for yourself sometime, I'd really love to see you show off the results. I plan to do the rest of the Eldari Combat Patrol over the next few video releases as a kind of exploration into the use of oil paints and how you can use them alongside your acrylics or sometimes in place of them. Now for my AAR. One thing is that I think that using a blue-brown chromatic black instead of pure black for the base layer before masking would be pretty cool. What do I mean by that? So if you remember the beginning of the video, the very beginning of the painting session, I had a black primed Wraithguard, and it was just straight out of the rattle can black. Well, artists often use what they call chromatic black, and what they mean by that is that instead of having an actual black pigment, they combine multiple colors to make a black instead, or make something near black, and that's called a chromatic black. And when I say a blue brown, what I mean is take a really, really dark brown and a really dark blue and combine them together, and that makes something that's very close to a black, but not quite black. And what's cool about that is that it makes a more interesting overall color, especially in the shadows. And for this model in particular, all of our colors were some form of blue or some form of brown. And so by using those two colors together to create the initial base black, it would really, I think, have made the rest of the color scheme pop a little better than it did at the end. I think the end result, the black on the model, maybe was a little bit flat. The other thing that would have been nice about that is that a lot of times when you have a out of the rattle can black, then yellow over the top of it, like when we speckled it, can turn out a little bit green. It didn't in the case of the airbrush version, and just because I think we managed to get large enough dollops on top that it didn't. But on the paint or the toothbrush flecking version of it, if you looked really closely, there was a couple spots where it did turn out a little bit green looking. Whereas with a chromatic black, you wind up usually with a little bit less greening of yellow. So there's a few advantages to using the chromatic black. And so I think if I were to do this again, that's what I would do. I would try to go with a blue-brown chromatic black, and probably edging a little bit more, slightly more brown than black, which is another nice advantage of using chromatic blacks, is that you can kind of push them in one direction or another. So you could make it a slightly more warm black by having more brown in it than blue, or slightly more cold black by putting more blue in it than brown. And so you have more control over kind of the color temperature of your miniature and the shadows of your miniature by changing up the ratios of the colors that you contribute to it. I'll probably do a chromatic black video at some point in the future as we get more into some of the cool things I've learned in color theory through my miniature journeys. All right, so then that's the first one on the AR, is trying to go for a more interesting black instead of just the pure rattle can black. The second one is, and I'm not sure if this came out in the video or not, but the initial bone color that I did for the airbrushed model was a good color. I thought I liked it. I did not wait long enough to paint the shade wash onto it, the initial shade wash that I did with the speed paint. And so there were some parts where it actually reactivated the paint. And so that can happen sometimes, especially when you have a very thin paint or a paint that's got a different kind of medium in it than what you initially laid. So what I mean by medium is that different paint brands use different liquids to suspend their pigments in, and so those liquids are called the medium. So if you have one paint down and it's not completely fully dry, then the medium of the next paint could potentially cause it to loosen again and cause it to be again reactivate, become wet again, essentially, or more wet, and actually come up off the paint, or off the model, which is exactly what happened in my case, especially since it was such a thin layer to begin with, because it was airbrushed on the axe, especially on the axe handle, especially when I went through and washed it, there was parts of it that actually just came right up again, and basically it was functionally unpainted at that point. And so that was one of the reasons why I went so heavy on the overbrushing with the titanium buff later in the video, was because I essentially had to replace that paint layer again on the axe handle and in other places. So lesson learned there, or AR comment there, is just make sure that you wait long enough for that paint layer to be fully dry, and make sure you're not reactivating by accident. Third comment would be that the wrapping and unwrapping of the spider web, that was an adventure. As I alluded to at the end of the unwrapping video, where I had a second model that was already unwrapped, I went through a couple iterations of that, where before the one I showed you, where I was kind of experimenting with a few different ways of doing it. The first one I did, I kind of made like a net, where I kind of made a cloud of spider web and tried to encase it in a cocoon, and that didn't really work very well. I thought it would go faster that way, but it really just didn't. It was very hard to manage that way. It was very hard to create the cocoon to begin with, and then it was very hard to get the coverage that I wanted. What I found most easy is what I ended up doing for the sponge-on version, which was actually the last one I did, and that was actually to make a very long and very thin strands, so almost spin the spider web into like a thread, like a thin thread kind of, and then that way when you wrap it, it's manageable as a thread. And then when you want to fray it in order to create some of the patterns on the flat armor plates, then you just kind of counter spin it to thin it out on those. And I talked about it a little bit in the video itself, but essentially, as you hit the flat armor plates, you can kind of hold the thread with your thumb, counter spin it to spread it out, put it on the plate, and then spin it back again to maintain the thread consistency. And so that was a helpful thing to learn, but I learned it too late to work on the airbrush version of the model. But what I found though was that, yeah, having it very thin, and then kind of manipulating the thread as you go to create the different patterns as you go, is much more efficient a way to manage the wrapping process. And then it's also easier during the unwrapping stage as well, because there's just a lot less of the fibers catching on random bits of your model when you pull it back off again that way. And it also makes for, I think anyway, a little bit bolder lines, and also the patterns, they're still random, but they're random in places that you want them to be random, instead of just kind of in hidden places, or kind of the back of the kneecap and things like that, where you're not necessarily going to see them as you have them on the tabletop, or as you're showing them off to your friends. The last thing that I'll say is that I think in the future, if I were to do this again, that I think I took the wrappings off too soon, actually. So doing more work on the model while it's masked, I think would be a good idea. So what I mean by that is, once it's masked, I pretty much just did kind of one color over it and did the painting one time. And I think that the next time I probably would go through and do like another layer of highlights on it, and maybe a shadow layer as well with the airbrush. And that way, and that applies both to the spider web mask as well as to the camo putty mask. And that way you're being more efficient with your time, right? You're getting some extra shading and highlighting that's consistent with the colors you're going for, and it's yeah, I mean, that's the main reason. You're getting more consistent shading and highlighting with the colors you're going for, and so you're making it pop a little bit more. I think in this case, I knew that I should have done that as I was doing it. I was just trying to go quickly for the video, I think, and that was just my fault. I was distracted by trying to provide content for you all, so my bad. I'll do better next time. Yeah, so those are my main AR comments. I'd love to hear your feedback as far as what you think went well, what you think went poorly, either in terms of how I produced the video, or in terms of how I delivered the model. If you found this video helpful or entertaining, please remember to like or subscribe. As I said, if you have questions, comments, complaints, please drop them in the comment section. Until next time, keep on looting.